Mar Titus Mead stands over an open parish register, his hands spotted with age, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Me, that woman. She does not set foot among decent people. That is the Duke of Ellesmere's voice. That is what he shouted in his own church, before God, before the bishop, before 300 witnesses in their Sunday best. I have kept this register for 40 years, every birth in this parish, every marriage, every burial, 40 years, and I have written exactly one lie in it. I am going to tell you about the day that lie almost won. The church was full that morning, full the way it is only full for a duke's son, candles burning gold, the bishop's voice rising over the font, blessing water, blessing an infant wrapped in lace so fine it looked like frost. And then a woman stepped forward from the back pew, plain coat, plain hands, a folded bundle of white cloth pressed to her chest like she was carrying her own heart outside her body. I knew her, Mrs. Mercy Walden, Nanny to the old house, before the old house burned down to nothing but a duke and his lies. The duke saw her face, and his own face went the color of the altar cloth. Me, that woman. 2 footmen took her by the arms. She did not scream. She did not fight the men. She only held that bundle tighter, and I saw the lace peeking from the fold of it, and my old heart nearly stopped in my chest, because I had seen that exact lace before. I had seen it in the portrait that hangs in the Priory's great hall. The portrait of Lady Clara Ellesmere, holding a child that everyone in this county believes never breathed. They dragged Mrs. Walden up the aisle of a church full of the county's finest people, past dukes and vicars and ladies in their pearls, and not one of them knew what she was holding. The duke had just thrown the true heir's proof out of his own church with his own hands. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Let me take you back. 8 months back to a night when the wind screamed against the windows of Ellesmere Priory and a woman was dying in the best bedroom in Cheshire. Lady Clara Ellesmere was 26 years old. She had been married to Lord Bastian Ellesmere for 3 years, and she had wanted a child so badly that she had prayed for one every single night. Now she had one, and it was killing her to give it to the world. The doctor's name was Hollis. He had delivered half the babies in the parish and buried a good number of the mothers too. And he knew death when it stood in a room with him. It was standing in that room now. "Get the nanny," Dr. Hollis said. "Get Mrs. Walden now." Mercy Walden had nursed Bastian himself as a boy 30 years before. She came running in her nightgown, hair loose, and found Lady Clara white as the sheets, and a newborn boy crying in the doctor's arms, red-faced and furious and alive. "He's breathing," Mercy whispered. "Thank God, he's breathing." "Listen to me," Dr. Hollis said, and his voice was low and fast, the voice of a man racing a clock. "Lord Bastian died on the Marne Road 3 weeks ago. This house has no master left in it but his brother, and his brother has debts that would frighten the devil himself." Mercy did not understand yet. She only held the baby. "Conrad Ellesmere has been asking me for a month what happens to the estate if this child does not survive. He asked me twice, Mrs. Walden. Twice is not curiosity. Twice is a plan." Lady Clara's hand moved on the blanket. Her lips shaped one word: Noel. "His name is Noel," the doctor said. "Write it down in your heart, because paper will lie to you before this is finished." Lady Clara Ellesmere died 11 minutes later, in the hour before dawn, and the wind did not stop screaming once. Dr. Hollis pressed a folded piece of paper into Mercy's hands, sealed with his own signature, stating the child was born alive, on this date, to this mother, in this house. "Ellesmere money is faster than the law," he said. "Faster than the church. Faster than truth itself if truth stands still long enough. Run. Take him tonight. Take him now, before the sun is up and before Conrad's men are in this house. Where? Anywhere he cannot be bought. God forgive me, Mrs. Walden. I am an old man and I am afraid, and I am asking a nanny to do what I have not the courage to do myself." Mercy Walden did not hesitate again. She wrapped the boy in his mother's own christening gown, the one sewn with lace to match the gown in the family portrait, and she walked out into the black cold with a living air against her chest and a dead woman's word in her ears. 1 hour later, a man arrived at the priory in a hired carriage, sent by Duke Conrad Ellesmere, carrying an envelope of banknotes thick enough to choke a horse. He found an empty cradle, a dead mother, and a doctor sitting very still by a cold fire. "The child?" the agent asked. "Stillborn," said Dr. Hollis. 2 syllables, the whole of his soul in them. The agent smiled like a man who has just won a card game he never doubted. "His Grace will be pleased it was quick." Do you understand what that means? A man came to buy a lie about a baby who was, at that very moment, alive and crying 3 miles away in a stranger's cart, and he paid for it, and no one stopped him, because the only 2 people who knew the truth were an old doctor with a guilty conscience and a nanny running through the dark with a stolen future in her arms. The funeral was held 4 days later. Ellesmere Priory does nothing small, not even grief. The county came in black. 200 carriages lined the drive. The bishop, who would 8 months later bless a false heir at the font, stood over a small white coffin and spoke of a family line cut short by cruel providence. Inside that coffin there was nothing, no child, just weight enough to fool the pallbearers. Arranged by a man who had paid for silence the way other men pay for wine. Duke Conrad Ellesmere stood at the graveside in a black coat that fit him like it had been made for this exact moment, and when he spoke, his voice cracked in exactly the right places. "My brother is gone, and now his line is ended with him. There is no heir. There is no Ellesmere left of that branch but me, and I will carry his name as far as I am able, though God knows it will never be far enough to fill the space he has left." Beautiful words, every one of them a lie standing on the grave of a bigger lie. Women wept into handkerchiefs. Men bowed their heads. The organ played low and slow, and not one soul in that church doubted him for a second. At the edge of the churchyard, behind the low stone wall, Mercy Walden stood in a borrowed shawl, watching a man weep for a child who was, at that moment, asleep against her own shoulder, milk-drunk and warm, and completely unaware he was the reason for the tears of 200 strangers. She did not go closer. She could not. She turned, and she walked away from the only home she had ever known, carrying the true heir of Ellesmere into a life of hiding. 3 weeks later, in the drawing room of Ellesmere Priory, Duchess Philippa Ellesmere sat before a row of infants brought from the Cheshire Foundling Hospital like a woman choosing a length of curtain fabric. "That one is too dark," she said, waving a gloved hand. "That one squints. That one there, turn him toward the light. Yes, that coloring will do. He has the family look, don't you think, Conrad?" Duke Conrad Ellesmere barely glanced up from his newspaper. "He has money's look, my dear. That is the only look that matters now." "Strong lungs, at least," Philippa said as the chosen infant began to howl. "Though I confess it cries commonly. Are we certain of its coloring?" "We are certain of its silence, if you pay the matron enough," Conrad said. "That is what we are certain of." That same week, Conrad gathered the household staff in the servants' hall and gave them their story, item by item, the way a general gives orders before a battle. The young master survived the birth, weak, and has been kept from public view on the doctor's orders until now for his health. That is the story. There is no other story. Anyone who repeats a different one will find themselves without a position and without a reference in this county or the next. The housekeeper nodded. The footman nodded. Fear is an excellent listener, but one young nursemaid, barely 20, new to the house and not yet trained out of curiosity, raised her hand like a schoolgirl. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I attended Lady Clara the week before her confinement, and she told me herself the child was to be called Noel if a boy. This child answers to nothing. He does not know his own name yet, of course, but is he not to be Noel?" The room went silent enough to hear a clock tick 3 rooms away. "You are dismissed," Conrad said. Calm, cold, final, effective today. You will receive no reference from this house. Your Grace? I only asked. You will receive no reference from this house, Conrad said again, slower, each word its own small hammer. And you will find, I suspect, that word travels quickly among the great houses of this county, about girls who ask too many questions of their betters. The girl left in tears that afternoon. Her career in service ended before it had properly begun, and every servant left standing in that hall understood the lesson perfectly. Silence had a price. So did curiosity, and in this house only one of them was rewarded. Duke Conrad Ellesmere had built himself a fortress of fear, brick by brick, out of other people's need to eat. He did not know yet that the very girl he had crushed underfoot would in time walk straight into the household of the Lord Lieutenant of the county, and that she would remember every word he had said to her and repeat every one of them to exactly the wrong ears at exactly the right time. That is coming. Hold on to it. For now, Conrad believed his fortress was finished. He believed the stillbirth was buried. The story was set, the servants were silent, and the county's grief for his brother's line was the only grief left to manage. He did not know a living, breathing air was, at that very hour, cutting his first tooth in a canal cottage 4 villages away, watched over by a woman who had given up everything to keep him alive. Conrad's peace did not last. Peace never does, for men who have built their houses on a lie. Within a month, whispers reached him. Servants' gossip travels faster than any coach, that a woman had been seen in 3 different villages with an infant, moving quickly, paying in cash, giving no name that matched twice. A woman who flinched at the sound of a fine carriage, a woman who kept to back lanes and church poor boxes. Conrad hired an agent, a quiet, thorough, unpleasant man named Sedley, who specialized in finding people who did not wish to be found. There is no child, Conrad told him, over brandy, in a study lined with his brother's old books. There is no child, do you understand me? There is only a former servant, unstable in her grief, who has taken up with someone else's baby out of some sad delusion. Find her, quietly. I want to know where she sleeps. Sedley found the trail 3 times, and 3 times it went cold, because Mercy Walden was cleverer and more frightened than Conrad had ever imagined a nanny could be. She sold her late husband's pocket watch in Nantwich to pay for a room. She told the woman at the lodging house her name was Mrs. Hale. She moved again after 2 weeks when a man in a good coat asked the baker one question too many about a woman traveling alone with a young child. At night, by candlelight, in whatever room she had rented that week, Mercy Walden sat with a needle and thread and sewed 3 things into the hem and lining of a baby's christening gown, the same gown Lady Clara had worn as an infant herself, the twin of the lace in the portrait hanging in Ellesmere's great hall. She sewed in Dr. Hollis's signed statement. She sewed in a lock of Lady Clara's hair, wrapped in paper, and she began to plan how she might reach the one man who held the 3rd and final proof. The parish register itself, with its true entry of a living birth kept safe by an old clerk named Titus Mead, who had written the truth before Conrad's money ever reached the church. That page was the missing piece. Without it, her word was only a servant's word against a duke's. With it, she had a case that could stand in a courtroom. But she could not walk up to that church. Conrad's agent watched every road that led there. She had tried twice and turned back twice, her heart hammering, certain she had been seen. Then, one bitter December morning, word reached her, carried through the same servants' network that had once dismissed a nursemaid for asking questions. The household network Conrad believed he had silenced, but which had only learned to whisper instead of speak. The Duke was holding a christening, a grand one, for his son and heir, the whole county invited, the bishop himself to bless the water, and Titus Mead, parish clerk of 40 years, would be there, as he was at every christening in that church, standing quietly by the register, exactly where Mercy needed him to be, in front of exactly the crowd that could protect her if she was brave enough to reach him. She had 1 month before the assize session closed for the year. After that, Dr. Hollis's statement would need living witnesses to support it in any court, and witnesses could be bought, threatened, or simply worn down by time, one by one, the way Conrad had already begun quietly buying the silence of 2 servants who had helped deliver messages for her in the early weeks. 1 month, one chance, one church full of exactly the kind of people whose good opinion Conrad needed more than his own soul. She dressed the baby in the very gown that held the proof. She walked to that church on the morning of the christening with her heart going like a hammer on an anvil, and she told herself the same thing over and over. You are not going to confront him. You are going to reach Meade. That is all. Reach Meade, and it is done. She did not know, walking through those church doors, that the moment Conrad's eyes found her face across that crowded nave, every ounce of color would drain out of him like water from a cracked jug, because a guilty man never forgets the one face that can end him. And there she was, standing in his church, holding his brother's true son on the very day he meant to make his lie permanent before God and the county both. That is where we began. 2 footmen dragged Mercy Walden up the aisle of Ellesmere's parish church while 300 witnesses in their Sunday finest stared and murmured and reached for their neighbor's arms. Me that woman, she does not set foot among decent people. The bishop's blessing died in his throat. The infant in Philippa's arms began to wail. Somewhere near the back, an elderly dowager gasped so loudly it echoed off the stone, and the sound ran down the pews like a shiver down a spine. Titus Meade stood by his register, pen still wet in his hand, and watched Mercy Walden clutch that folded gown to her chest as the footman hauled her backward, and he saw, he could not unsee it, the lace at the edge of the bundle, fine as frost, exactly matching the lace in the portrait that hung above the priory's great staircase, the portrait of Lady Clara Ellesmere, holding a child the whole county believed had never drawn breath. Meade's pen went still on the page. He looked at Duke Conrad Ellesmere, who stood at the font with his hands shaking so hard the bishop actually paused mid-word to glance at him, and Meade understood, in one terrible instant, exactly what his 40 years of honest ink had been guarding without his even knowing it. He had written one lie in that register at Conrad's insistence 8 months before, a single false line recording a stillbirth that never happened. And he had, out of an old habit he could not explain even to himself, torn the true page from an earlier section of the register. The page recording a living birth, in Dr. Hollis's own words, witnessed and dated, and kept it folded inside his coat, because something in him, some instinct 40 years in God's house had built, told him it might matter again one day. That day had just walked up his aisle in a plain coat, dragged by 2 footmen, while the Duke of Ellesmere screamed at her in front of the bishop. Meade's hand went to his breast pocket, where the folded page waited, and for the first time in 8 months, he understood exactly what it was worth, and to whom. Mercy did not fight the footman at the door. She let herself be put out onto the church steps, into the cold, and she stood there a moment, breathing hard, the baby crying against her, and she looked back once through the open door at Titus Meade. He looked back at her. He did not smile. He gave the smallest nod a man can give and still call it a nod. It was enough. She had found him. Now she only had to survive until the moment she could reach him properly. Word of the scene at the christening did not stay inside those church walls. It could not. 300 witnesses do not keep a secret. They carry it home to 300 dinner tables, and a story told at 300 dinner tables becomes, within a week, the only story anyone in the county is discussing. Duke Conrad Ellesmere told it his own way, at his own table, to his own guests. A former servant of my brother's, unfortunately unstable since his death. Grief does strange things to weak minds. I regret the disturbance to the ceremony, but a man must protect his household from such people. Most of the county nodded and accepted it, the way most people accept whatever a duke tells them, because it is easier than doubting a duke. But not everyone. The dismissed nursemaid, the girl Conrad had thrown out of his service for asking one honest question, had, by that winter, found a position in the household of the Lord Lieutenant of Cheshire himself, one of the few men in the county whose good opinion Conrad genuinely needed. She had been careful, hard-working, and grateful for the chance, and she had said nothing of her old post for months. But when talk of the disturbance at the Ellesmere christening reached the Lord Lieutenant's servants' hall, she went very quiet over the washing, and one of the older maids noticed. "You've gone pale as milk, girl. What is it?" "Nothing," the girl said. Then, because 8 months is a long time to carry a secret that was never truly hers to carry, and because the last time she had spoken honestly it had cost her everything, and because it was clear now that speaking honestly might finally cost her nothing at all, she said more. "I was in service at Ellesmere Priory. Before, I was there when the young master was born, the true one, Lord Bastion's son. I heard he lived. I said so. I was dismissed the same day with no reference." The older maid's eyes went wide, and word moved again, this time upward, the way it always eventually does in a house full of servants and one attentive master, until it reached the ear of the Lord Lieutenant himself. He did not act on gossip alone. He was too careful a man for that. But he remembered the name. He filed it away the way careful men file dangerous things, quietly, and for later. Meanwhile, no, not meanwhile, all at once, in the same weeks, Duchess Philippa Ellesmere was learning a harder lesson about the child she had chosen for his coloring. At a small dinner in a neighboring house, an elderly dowager who had known Lord Bastion since he was in short trousers leaned over the infant's basket, studied his face for a long, uncomfortable moment, and said, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the table, "Strange. There's no Ellesmere in that face at all." The table went silent. Philippa's fan stopped moving. Conrad's smile froze halfway formed. "He favors his mother's side, I'm told," Conrad said smoothly, recovering first, as he always did. "Is that so?" The dowager said, not quite a question, not quite an accusation, but close enough to both that 3 other guests exchanged glances over their soup, and one lady later remarked to her husband in the carriage home that something about the whole business had never sat right with her. Not since the funeral, not since that curiously heavy little coffin. She remembered the pallbearers straining under for a supposedly newborn weight. Small cracks. That is how a fortress built on lies begins to fall. Not all at once, but crack by crack, dinner by dinner, whisper by whisper, until the walls remember they were never truly load-bearing. And in his study, Conrad's desperation showed itself in smaller, uglier ways. He summoned Sedley the agent again. "You have failed me for 8 months, Conrad said. 8 months, and a woman with an infant has made a fool of you 3 times over." "She is careful, your grace." "Then be more careful than she is. I will double your fee. Find her before the assize session closes. Do you understand me? Before." Sedley took the increase without comment, but he was not a foolish man, and a duke who doubles a fee to silence a nanny is a duke who is frightened, and a frightened duke is a duke worth watching closely. From that week on, Sedley began keeping his own careful record of every payment Conrad made him, every instruction, every hint of what exactly he was being paid to bury. An insurance policy in case the wind ever turned. He did not yet know how soon it would. Small winds. A servant girl finding her voice in a powerful house, a dowager's sharp eye at a dinner table, an agent's private ledger growing heavier by the week, none of them the ending, but each one a stone added to the weight that would, in time, crush a duke flat. Mercy Walden knew none of this directly. She knew only the cold and the ticking clock of the assize session, and a baby who was teething badly and cried through most nights in whatever cottage she could afford that month. She had settled finally in a small canal-side cottage 2 villages from Ellesmere, rented under yet another borrowed name, and there she stayed as still as she dared, feeding Noel from a spoon now, watching him grow into a solemn, dark-eyed boy who had his father's exact frown and, Mercy sometimes thought with an ache she could not afford to indulge, his mother's exact stubbornness. She wrote to Titus Mead. Careful, unsigned letters, delivered by a boy she paid a penny at a time, asking only whether he still held the page. His answers came back the same way, short, cautious, and certain. I hold it. It has not left my coat since the day of the christening. Come when you are ready, and I will do what an honest man can do. But readiness, Mercy learned, is not always a choice you get to make on your own schedule. The assize session's final week arrived faster than she had allowed herself to believe possible, and with it came news that changed everything. The Lord Lieutenant of Cheshire, having quietly gathered the nursemaid's account, a petition slipped to him by Titus Mead himself under seal, and his own private unease about a coffin he remembered being unaccountably heavy for a newborn's weight, made a decision. He would convene the county's great and good at Ellesmere Priory itself, under the polite fiction of formally honoring the young heir before the assize session closed for the year. A gathering no duke could refuse to host without inviting far worse suspicion than the one he was trying to avoid. Conrad received the invitation to host his own downfall with his own hands, and read it twice, and felt something cold settle in his stomach that he did not have a name for yet. Because men who have never been caught do not recognize the feeling of being cornered until the walls are already closing. It is an honor, he told Philippa that evening, forcing the words out steady. The Lord Lieutenant himself coming to bless our son's place in this county. We shall make it the grandest evening Ellesmere has held in a generation. Will Mead be there? Philippa asked, some old instinct of her own stirring uneasily. The clerk. After that dreadful business at the christening. Med is a parish clerk, Conrad said too quickly. He goes where he is invited. He is nothing. He did not believe his own words, and some part of him knew it, even as he said them, and that night, for the first time in 8 months, Duke Conrad Ellesmere did not sleep at all. The night of the great gathering arrived cold and clear, stars hard as chips of ice over Ellesmere Priory, every window blazing with candlelight, carriages lining the drive 3 deep, the great hall dressed in its finest for a celebration that was, unknown to its host, actually a trial. The Lord Lieutenant arrived with quiet, watchful dignity. Behind him came magistrates, clergy, half the titled families of Cheshire, all of them believing, or pretending to believe, that they had come to toast a duke's heir. Duchess Philippa moved through the crowd in diamonds that cost more than most of the guests' houses, the foundling child dressed in white lace, and paraded from arm to arm like a prize won at a fair. Duke Conrad Ellesmere stood beneath his brother's portrait, Lady Clara Ellesmere, painted 3 years before her death, holding an infant in a christening gown trimmed with lace so fine it looked spun from frost, and he performed fatherhood for the room with every ounce of charm he possessed. My family's line continues, he said, raising a glass, his voice carrying to every corner of that vast hall. Whatever cruelty Providence dealt my brother, it has been repaid tenfold in this child. Ellesmere endures. Applause rippled through the room. Glasses lifted, crystal ringing, and then the great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Titus Mead walked in, an old parish register clutched against his chest with both arms, and the applause died in patches, like candles snuffed one by one down a table. Conrad's glass stopped halfway to his lips. His face went the color of the tablecloth. Med, he said, and his voice cracked exactly the way it had cracked at his brother's funeral, except this time there was no grief in it at all, only fear. This is a private celebration. I have written 1 lie in 40 years, Your Grace, Mead said, his old voice somehow filling the whole enormous room without a single shout. Today I am correcting my ledger. He set the register on the nearest table and opened it, and every guest in that hall craned forward despite themselves, the way a crowd always leans toward the thing it is not supposed to want to see. 8 months ago, Mead said, I recorded, at this man's insistence, and for a sum of money I am ashamed to say I once nearly accepted, that a child born to Lady Clara Ellesmere on the night of her death was stillborn. I wrote the lie. God forgive me, I wrote it in my own hand. Gasps ran down the hall like a wave breaking against stone. But before that lie was written, Meade continued, drawing a folded, yellowed page from inside his coat, its torn edge matching perfectly the ragged binding of the register before him, I had already recorded the truth on the night itself, before any money reached this house. A living male child, born to Lady Clara Ellesmere, delivered breathing at 11 minutes past 4 in the morning, attended by Dr. Josiah Hollis, whose signature you may see here for yourselves. He held the page high, and the room's silence had a texture to it now, thick as fog, 300 people not breathing at once. The great doors opened again. Mercy Walden walked into Ellesmere's hall in a plain coat, carrying a boy of 8 months dressed in a christening gown, trimmed with lace, so fine it looked spun from frost, the exact twin of the lace in the portrait hanging above the Duke's own head. Every eye in that room went from the child in her arms to the painting above the mantel and back again, and the collective gasp that followed was not scattered this time. It was one single sound, rising from 300 throats together, the sound of an entire county understanding the truth in the same instant. The Lord Lieutenant rose from his chair. "Your Grace," he said to Conrad, and his voice was terrible in its calm. "I believe you have some explaining to do." Mercy walked the length of that hall, past faces frozen mid-breath, past a duchess, whose diamonds suddenly looked like nothing at all, and she stopped directly beneath the portrait of Lady Clara Ellesmere, so that every guest could see, side by side, the painted lace and the living lace, and know them for the same cloth. "This is Noel," Mercy said, her voice shaking but not breaking, "son of Lord Bastian and Lady Clara Ellesmere. He has been alive every single day since his birth, while this county mourned a coffin with nothing inside it." The hall erupted. Not applause this time, but a rising storm of voices, ladies clutching their husbands' arms, an old dowager pressing a hand to her chest and murmuring, "I said it. I said there was no Ellesmere in that other child's face. I said it at the table and no one listened." Conrad's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. The color drained so completely from his face that he looked, for the first time in his life, like a small and frightened man instead of a duke. "This is madness," Philippa managed at last, her voice too high, too fast. "This woman is unstable. She has always been unstable. She was dismissed from—" "She was not dismissed, Your Grace," said a new voice, and the crowd parted to reveal the young nursemaid, now grown a year older and a good deal braver, standing at the Lord Lieutenant's side, invited by him for exactly this moment. "I was dismissed. For telling the truth about a name. My lady, if you please, tell them what name you gave that gentleman there when you dismissed me." Philippa said nothing. There was nothing left to say. "Bring the christening gown to the light," the Lord Lieutenant said, and Mercy, at last, unpicked the careful stitches of the hem in front of every witness in that hall, and drew out a folded, signed statement in Dr. Hollis's own hand, and a lock of pale hair wrapped in old paper, and held them up beside the register page. Meade still gripped, 3 proofs standing together where, a moment before, there had only been a duke's word. Dr. Hollis's statement, the Lord Lieutenant read aloud, into a silence so total that his voice seemed to echo off every stone in the hall, records a living birth, this date, this hour, witnessed by his own hand at Lady Clara Ellesmere's deathbed. It matches, word for word, the entry Mr. Meade has held safe in this parish register for 8 months. He turned to Conrad, and his voice hardened into something that had judged men before and would judge this one now. "You buried an empty coffin, Your Grace, before this entire county's grieving eyes. You paid to falsify a parish register. You hounded a widow's true son and the woman protecting him across 3 counties for 8 months, while presenting a foundling child as your brother's heir to every family in Cheshire. I, Conrad started and stopped because there was no sentence that finished that thought in his favor. It was at that moment that Sedley the agent, standing near the back of the hall in his good coat, stepped forward with the particular calm of a man who has decided at last to protect himself rather than his employer. "I have receipts, my lord," he said, and drew a folded ledger from his own coat. "Every payment his grace made me. The stillbirth certificate, purchased for £200 the morning after Lady Clara's death. The register entry, £400 to Mr. Meade, which Mr. Meade never accepted, I should note, for the record. My own fee doubled twice over the past 2 months as his grace grew more anxious to find this woman before tonight." He read the figures aloud, one by one, into the ringing silence, and each number landed on Conrad like a stone. "Item," Sedley read, £200, stillbirth certificate. "Item, £100, silence money to a lodging-house keeper in Nantwich, 3 months past. Item, £50, silence money to a baker's boy in the same town, same month. Item." "Enough," the Lord Lieutenant said, and the word cut through the hall like a bell. "I have heard sufficient, Mr. Sedley. Your honesty tonight will be remembered, whatever your part in the earlier deception." He turned to Conrad, and every guest in that vast hall leaned forward as one, the way a crowd leans toward the moment it has been waiting for all its life without knowing it. "Your Grace," the Lord Lieutenant said, "you stood in your own church 8 months past and said a woman does not set foot among decent people. I find upon reflection that you were entirely right. You simply named the wrong person." He nodded once to the footman at the door, Conrad's own footman, standing frozen, uncertain now which master they answered to. "Escort him from the hall," the Lord Lieutenant said. "He does not set foot among decent people." Conrad's own words, handed back to him whole, in front of every soul who had heard him shout them at a church door 8 months before. The footmen, his footmen, the very men who had dragged Mercy Walden up the aisle at his command, moved forward, and this time it was the Duke's arms they took, and the Duke's feet that stumbled on the marble as he was walked toward the doors of a house that in that exact instant stopped belonging to him. The hall did not stay silent for that part. It roared, 200 voices at once, some in shock, some, the dowager loudest among them, in something close to satisfaction, the sound of a county's disgust finally given permission to speak itself out loud. Philippa stood alone beside the mantel, diamonds still around her throat, the foundling child still in the arms of a nursery-maid nearby. And she watched Mercy Walden shift Noel gently onto one hip and reach out, without a word of cruelty, without a single unkind glance, to take the foundling boy onto her other hip as well, holding both children with the same steady, practiced tenderness. It was not an act of triumph. It was worse than that for Philippa. It was an act of simple decency, performed effortlessly by the very woman she had thrown out of a church, in front of every family whose good opinion Philippa had spent 8 months trying to buy with diamonds and false lace. And the contrast between the two women, standing there in that hall, one who had risked everything to keep 2 children safe, one who had chosen a baby the way she chose curtain fabric, said more than any sentence the Lord Lieutenant could have handed down. "The coffin," Meade said quietly into the settling roar, "should be examined, my lord, for the county's peace of mind, if nothing else." It was done within the week, under magistrate's order, in the presence of the very men who had wept at that graveside 8 months before. The small white coffin was raised, opened, and found exactly as Dr. Hollis had known it would be found the night he pressed a living child into a nanny's arms and told her to run. Empty. Weighted with nothing but stones and folded linen, buried with false tears by a man who had counted on grief being too polite to ask questions. Conrad Ellesmere was stripped of the guardianship, the estate, and, within the assize session that closed that same week, faced formal charges of fraud, falsification of parish records, and the purchase of false certification, charges that would, in the following spring, See him removed entirely from Ellesmere Priory and from the county's good opinion for the remainder of his days. Philippa left with him, her diamonds sold within the year to pay legal costs neither of them had ever imagined needing. Noel Ellesmere, true son of Lord Bastian and Lady Clara, was confirmed heir to Ellesmere Priory under the guardianship of trustees appointed by the Lord Lieutenant himself. His birthright restored on the strength of a register page an old man had kept folded against his chest for 8 months out of nothing more than an honest instinct he could not fully explain. Mercy Walden was offered, in the weeks that followed, the position of estate manager, and then housekeeper, and then twice more a title grander than either, and twice more she refused, asking only for the one post she actually wanted. Head of Noel's nursery. The same work she had always done, the work she had never truly stopped doing, even hunted, even hiding, even sewing evidence into hems by candlelight in a cold rented room. She was given it, with a pension larger than any nanny in the county had ever been offered, and a small cottage on the estate grounds of her own. And she took Noel home to Ellesmere Priory for the first time in his life, into the great hall where his mother's portrait still hung, the painted lace and the real lace finally under the same roof, finally telling the same true story. And at her insistence, hers alone, against the trustees' mild surprise, the foundling boy Philippa had chosen for his coloring was not sent back to the hospital that had raised him, was not abandoned a second time by people who had only ever seen him as furniture. He was kept at the priory, raised alongside Noel as his foster brother, given the same nursery, the same nanny, the same warm fire on cold nights, because Mercy Walden had decided, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, that no child in her care would ever again be discarded the way he so nearly was. Titus Mead closed his parish register that same winter on 2 newly corrected lines. One birth restored to its truth, one fraud recorded in full in his own honest hand for any clerk who came after him to read for the next 100 years. He looked up from the page, the way he had looked up at the start of this story, and he had one more thing to say. Every parish has a register. Every family has one too, even if it is never written down on paper, a page somewhere that says who was truly born, and who was truly loved, and who tried to tear that page out for their own convenience. Ask yourself, tonight, who keeps yours? Ask yourself whether that person would still be standing, honest and unbought, 8 months into the dark. The way an old clerk and a frightened nanny stood for a child who could not yet stand for himself. Paper burns. Coffins lie. Money forgets its own promises the moment they become inconvenient. But a witness with clean hands outlasts all three, every single time, if you are patient enough to let the truth arrive. Here is the question we leave you with tonight. Mercy Walden hid the true heir of Ellesmere for 8 long months, while a fraud was christened in his place before the entire county. Was every one of those months justified caution, keeping a defenseless child alive against a duke's money and a duke's men? Or did her hiding come within one assize session of handing Conrad Ellesmere the whole estate forever? Tell us in the comments which side you stand on. We suspect you will not all agree. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.